David wakes up 8 years into the future with the whole world aging except for himself. When the authorities are alerted of his existence, they take him to a secret facility for testing. As the scientists try to find the answers to David's strange case, he discovers that he shares a deep connection with an alien spacecraft. On July 4, 1978, David watches a dog frisbee competition in the park with his dog Bruiser. When his parents, Helen and Bill, are packing their things into the car, David argues with his brother Jeff about Bruiser's potential as a frisbee champion. Suddenly, a large shadow casts over the crowd, and the people look up into the sky. A zeppelin flies overhead, to the brothers' awe. On the ride home, Jeff teases David about his crush on Jennifer, to his annoyance. He places his brother in a headlock and knuckles his head until Bill tells them to cut it out. Jeff sees his friends playing outside a house, so he asks his parents to drop him off, and he'll walk home later. As they drive away, the brothers continue mocking each other, and David says he'll make sure Jeff never sees his 9th birthday. Bill doesn't appreciate David's joke, so the boy apologizes to his father. When they get to the house, Jennifer rides by on her bike and says hi to David, and he shyly returns the greeting. He heads to his bedroom, where he watches Jennifer through his telescope. Bill walks in and asks what he's doing, so David lies and says he's just looking at the boats. Bill peeks through the eyepiece, sees what his son is actually observing, and gives him advice on how to do well with the ladies. That evening, Helen asks David to meet Jeff by the forest road to make sure he gets home safely. Although he thinks Jeff is old enough to walk through the forest alone, he obliges and takes Bruiser with him. In the forest, David hears a strange noise and follows it through the trees. He picks up a stick from the ground to protect himself. All of a sudden, his mischievous brother jumps down from a tree to scare him. Jeff runs away laughing, and David is about to chase him when he hears Bruiser's urgent barking a few feet away. David finds Bruiser by the edge of a ravine, staring down and barking furiously at something David can't quite make out. He steps closer to the edge and holds onto a vine to steady himself. Suddenly, the vine breaks. He lands at the bottom and loses consciousness. When David wakes up, he stands back on his feet and calls out to Bruiser, but the dog doesn't answer. He climbs back onto the ravine's edge and makes his way home. Outside the house, David bangs on the door, furiously calling his brother to open the locked door. When somebody finally opens up, David is surprised to see an unfamiliar older woman. Confused, David asks her who she is, and the woman returns the question. David runs into the house, bewildered by his surroundings. He heads up to his room, but instead of his things occupying the space, he finds an older man in an armchair. The kind man tries to calm him down, and David finally breaks down in tears, asking the befuddled older couple where his parents are. Later, at the police station, a female officer informs Detective Banks that David was a missing person case filed years ago, described as wearing the exact same clothes the boy's wearing right now. The detective thinks the date on the report must have been a typo, but the female officer already checked it 3 times. In the police car, the female officer asks David what year he thinks it is, and he says it's 1978. Then, Detective Banks asks him who the president is, and while David thinks the questions are unnecessary, he says the president is Jimmy Carter, and the 2 police officers share a concerned look. Outside an unfamiliar house, the detective knocks on the door, and David is surprised to see his father answer. David runs toward his father but is shocked by his graying hair. Seconds later, his mother joins them, and the overwhelming welcome causes the exhausted David to pass out. Meanwhile, NASA scientist Dr. Faraday arrives at the site of a UFO crash. He speaks with the night watchman, who says the sleek silver spacecraft crashed into one of the electrical towers and is now floating a few feet above the ground. When the doctor asks his colleague how to transport the massive object, the watchman pushes the spacecraft with minimal effort, causing it to float forward. At the hospital, David's parents ask him where he's been all these years, and he insists he's only been gone for a couple hours. Minutes later, Jeff pays him a visit, but David doesn't believe it's him because Jeff is now in his late teens. Jeff apologizes for spooking him in the forest that day and shows him a missing person poster with his image. He tells David that their parents were inconsolable when he went missing, and made Jeff post the missing person flyers on telephone poles and trees for years. Jeff then says it's 1986, before knuckling David's head the way he used to do it to him. When their parents return, David sobs and says he wants to go home. Bill explains that the doctors want to keep him in the hospital for a few days to run some tests so they can figure out what happened to him and why he stayed the same age all these years. The next day, NASA transports the UFO to their base hangar. In the hospital, David wakes abruptly and says someone is trying to speak to him, asking him for help. Jeff comforts him by saying that it was probably just a bad dream. In the NASA facility, Dr. Faraday's men have tried everything to open the vessel, but they say it's impregnable. The doctor wants them to keep trying in case there are any living organisms inside. In the hospital, while a doctor asks David to recount the events of the night of July 4, 1978, multiple electrodes on his head track his brainwaves. Suddenly, the computers go haywire, and the technician says David is transmitting in alpha waves with complex frequency patterns. Another technician notes that David is communicating directly with the computer in binary code. Seconds later, a 3D image that looks just like the UFO, along with an alien language, appears on the monitor, which the doctor believes is coming directly from David's brain. In the NASA office, Dr. Faraday receives the faxed printout of the image from David's brain and realizes it looks like the vessel currently in their facility. Days later, Dr. Faraday speaks with the family about his suggestion to take David to the NASA base for 48 hours to perform more tests using state-of-the-art technology that the local hospital cannot provide. At first, David and his parents are against it, wanting him to move on with his life. Eventually, the doctor convinces David when he taps into the boy's curiosity to discover all the answers to his strange situation. As they drive closer to the facility, David hears a mysterious voice that only he can perceive. In his room, the doctors laid out toys on his bed and even furnished it with a cable TV. He asks Faraday why there isn't a phone in the room, and the doctor says they can call his family together tomorrow before locking the sliding door as he leaves. Later, a robot barges into the room, scaring David. Then, intern Carolyn cheerfully introduces herself and the robot as Ralph, or Robotic Assistant Labor Facilitator. The woman catches David up on pop culture for the last 8 years when she realizes he's serious about missing that span of time due to an unknown reason. The next day, Jeff tosses a frisbee around, and Bruiser easily catches the disc, implying that he's trained the dog well since David's disappearance. Later, the family speaks with David over the phone, who tells them the doctors lock him inside his room, which Dr. Faraday quickly explains it's for his safety. Helen reminds the doctor to bring David back after 48 hours. During the testing, David's brain provides the scientists with answers to their questions on the monitors, even though he isn't answering them out loud. The entity inside David's brain says he is from a planet called Phalon, which is 560 light-years away. Faraday asks how long it takes to travel that distance, and it answers 2.2 hours. When asked where Phalon is, it shows the scientists a star system that isn't in their database. The doctor theorizes that David traveled to and from Phalon at the speed of light, which took him 4.4 hours total. But because time slows down at this speed, the Earth aged 8 years in comparison. Overwhelmed, David removes the electrodes from his head and returns to his room. Carolyn arrives to give David his meal, and he expresses relief that he'll be leaving the facility tomorrow. Carolyn reveals that she's seen his name in the meal sheet for the next week, meaning the scientists plan to keep him for at least another 7 days. David freaks out and bangs on the one-way glass, yelling at the guards watching him that they promised he'd only be there 2 days. He stands by the wall, a blind spot for the guards, and begs Carolyn to contact her family and tell them what's happening to him. She gives him a wink and then pretends to return to her duties to avoid suspicion. At dawn, David hears a voice from the hangar asking him for help. Ralph enters the room, and the voice tells him to get inside it, so David draws the curtain and slyly squeezes into the robot's compartment. Ralph takes David to the hangar, where he finds the silver vessel tethered under straps. Suddenly, an opening appears, inviting David to come inside. The interior of the spacecraft is lined with textured silver walls. As David walks further into the vessel, a throne-like chair rises from the floor behind him. When he falls into the chair, a glowing orb attached to a metal arm reveals itself and speaks to him in an alien language. The orb calls him Navigator and tells him to sit down. It says it was the one who's been calling David because his brain contains the information it requires to complete its mission. When David argues that he doesn't know any of the vectors the orb speaks of, it explains that it programmed David's brain with all the appropriate star charts. In the security room, guards see the opening on the vessel and alert all personnel, including Dr. Faraday. They head to the hangar, where they find David peeking at them. The orb awaits David's orders but suggests they depart from the area immediately, which the kid agrees to. The opening closes up, and the spacecraft slowly moves toward the hangar door, lifting the weights with relative ease. Blue lasers shoot the door locks, opening the hangar door. The ship exits the warehouse, where the NASA employees watch in awe as the vessel shoots up into space 20 miles up, according to David's orders. When David clarifies that he meant to travel 20 miles on the ground, the orb brings the ship back down to the hangar entrance. Impressed, David wonders what else the orb can make the ship do, so it morphs into an aerodynamic shape before shooting forward over the marshes. When it has traversed precisely 20 miles, the ship stops in a field where cows are roaming, and David orders the door to open because he needs to urinate. Meanwhile, NASA tracks down the ship's location, and Faraday orders helicopters to follow it there. While David goes about his business, he asks the orb what it's doing on Earth, and the orb says it comes from Phalon to borrow life samples from different galaxies for study. The orb chose David as a sample from Earth. Back in Phalon, they discovered that humans only use 10% of their brains, so they filled the remaining 90% with star charts to see what would happen. The vessel crashed into the electrical towers, erasing all its star charts, which is why it now needs the information inside David's head. The orb won't be able to fly the ship without it. David asks the orb why it took him 8 years before returning him, and the orb says their study revealed that the human body is too fragile to travel back in time. Resigned, David says if the orb can't take him back in time, it should at least take him back home. Just as the NASA helicopters arrive, the orb agrees to take him home after they perform a mind transfer to extract the star charts from the kid's brain. David goes back to the ship and orders the orb to take them away from the pursuers. The orb plunges the spacecraft into the ocean to avoid tracking by NASA. David asks its name, and it answers that it's a Trimaxion drone ship, but the long name compels the kid to simply call it Max. Max then prepares the circuitry for mind transfer while David observes the other samples. Max plans to return to their home planets after David. David sees a puck marin, a cute bat-like creature Max characterizes as harmless. David holds the creature in his hand as Max explains that the puck marin doesn't know a comet destroyed its home planet. Sympathetic, David wishes he could take the puck marin home with him since it's now an orphan. At the facility, Dr. Faraday receives a call from Bill asking to speak to David. The doctor manages to stall and says he'll have David call back his father as soon as he can. The doctor then orders his men to locate the last person David spoke to, Carolyn. On the ship, Max is ready to perform the mind transfer. David is scared the procedure might be painful but is pleasantly surprised when the simple scan takes a few seconds. Max also accidentally extracts the contents of David's brain that have nothing to do with navigating, and the alien starts to act like David's brother Jeff. David and Max suddenly have a playful but combative conversation, just as Max takes the ship into outer space again. When David teases the alien about its abilities as a navigator, Max shuts down the engines and allows the vessel to freefall. Panicked, David apologizes to Max as he fumbles around the seat for the controls. Max refuses to follow David's orders, but gives the kid hints as to where the start engine button is. Just as the ship is about to crash, David pushes the button, turning the engines back on. He then figures out how to use the navigation controls and steers the vessel expertly through the sky. Meanwhile, the NASA employees track down Carolyn to the family's house, where the woman is catching them up to David's misadventures. The NASA guard catches Carolyn sneaking out the back door while the others inform Bill that the family must remain confined in their home for the time being. As David tries to navigate the ship home, he finds himself in Tokyo, where the locals take snapshots of the UFO. When they're finally able to return to the USA, they swing by the Golden Gate Bridge before finally deciding to ask for directions from a car of frightened friends. Max asks David about the sounds that were coming from the car, and David explains that it's music. He orders Max to access radio waves to play music as they fly across the country. In the outskirts of Florida, the ship stops by a gas station where David calls up Jeff and tells them he doesn't know where their new house is, so he'll need a signal visible in the night sky. Before returning to the spacecraft, David takes a Florida map from the store. Resuming their journey, David orders Max to follow the highway that'll take them directly to his home city. Soon, David recognizes the Miami Beach coastline and figures the house must be close by. Jeff finds old fireworks in the house and quickly takes them up to the roof. The first few fireworks are duds and don't fly into the air. Finally, Jeff launches several fireworks, prompting their parents and the NASA officers to run out of the house. David sees the fireworks in the air and heads towards them. He expresses sadness at the thought of all his friends being 20 years old. The alien comforts him by saying he'll at least be with his family now. Outside the house, Dr. Faraday and the authorities arrive just as the spaceship lands. David sees the flashing lights from the police cars and wishes they would leave him alone. Max understands that he's worried they'll take him away again, then apologizes for being responsible for David's challenging situation. As David steps out of the vessel, he's overwhelmed by the presence of the authorities and tells his parents that he loves them, but that he doesn't belong there anymore. David runs back into the ship and tells Max to take him away. Outside, his family runs toward the ship calling his name, begging him to come back. Max thinks he should be with his family, but David argues that while it is his family, it isn't his home. He wishes to go back to 1978 because he knows the scientists will only treat him like a guinea pig for the rest of his life if he chooses to stay. Max reiterates there's a high possibility he'll be vaporized if he takes him back in time, but David is willing to take the risk. Before the time warp, the friends share how much they'll miss each other. After the time jump, David wakes up at the bottom of the ravine. He walks home and heads for the front door, where he hears his parents call out his name from the dock. Realizing he's returned safely back in 1978, the elated David joins his family on the boat and tells his mother that he loves her, surprising the woman. Jeff asks David if he's mad he spooked him in the woods, but David says he isn't and that he loves him too, stunning his mischievous brother. From David's backpack, the puck marin rears its tiny head, and Jeff is at a loss for words. David gestures to his brother to keep their little secret, just as Max's ship flies overhead in the firework-lit night sky.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.